At my wife's funeral, I thought grief would be my greatest burden. But then my son stood up, looked straight at me and said, "Dad should have gone first. He's useless without her." The room laughed. I sat frozen, humiliated, drowning in shame. And then the lawyer stood. He opened a folder and read Margaret's last letter. By the time her voice filled that church, the laughter was gone. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My name is Richard Hale. I am 72 years old, and if you are listening to this, know that I never imagined my life would come to this moment. A widower, standing at the funeral of the only woman who ever made me feel whole, forced to watch my own flesh and blood, my son, treat me like a burden to be mocked. My wife, Margaret, had been my anchor for over 45 years. She was my compass, my confidant, my strength through every storm. When cancer finally took her, I thought grief would be my greatest trial. But I was wrong. The church was filled with the scent of lilies and polished wood, the kind of fragrance you only notice at weddings and funerals. Margaret's casket lay at the front, draped in white roses, her photograph framed beside it. A smile frozen in time, one that had carried me through decades of hardship, was now the only version of her left in the world. People murmured condolences, some sincere, others perfunctory. The pews creaked under the weight of friends, neighbors, distant relatives, all gathered to pay respects. Yet beneath the solemn atmosphere, I felt an undercurrent I couldn't quite name, until my son stood up. Ethan, my firstborn. The boy I had held with trembling hands the day he was born. The boy I had coached through Little League, helped through college, even bailed out when his business ventures collapsed. He stood there now in an expensive suit, his tie knotted a little too tightly, his jaw clenched as if he were carrying a secret satisfaction. The room quieted as he began to speak, everyone expecting words of grief, of love for his mother. Instead, he looked at me with eyes sharp enough to cut glass and said, "Dad should have gone first. He's useless without her." The words cracked through the church like a gunshot. For a second, the silence was absolute. Then, to my horror, a few people laughed. Not nervous chuckles, not stifled gasps, but actual laughter. Neighbors, distant cousins, people who should have known better. The sound was cruel, jagged, and it carved into me deeper than any knife. My legs trembled. My hands gripped the pew in front of me so tightly that my knuckles went white. My heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time in decades, I wished Margaret were still here to hold me up. I tried to speak, to tell Ethan to stop, but my voice was gone. The grief that had already been suffocating me now mingled with humiliation so raw it felt like acid in my veins. I stared at my son, waiting for him to correct himself, to say he'd spoken in anger, to remind the room that grief makes fools of us all. But he didn't. His lips curled into a smirk, the kind of expression that told me he meant every word. "Without Mom," Ethan continued, his tone almost casual, "he's just a hollow man. Nothing left to contribute. You'll see. He'll fade away before the year ends." The laughter swelled again. I could feel eyes on me, some pitying, others amused, a few avoiding my gaze entirely. I wanted to shout, to defend myself, to remind them of who I had been, a man who worked 3 jobs to provide, who stayed faithful through decades of marriage, who never once faltered in his duty as husband and father. But none of that mattered in that moment. My son had written me off in front of everyone, and the room had chosen to believe him. And then it happened. The lawyer stood. At first, no one noticed. He was a quiet man, small-framed, glasses perched on his nose, the kind of figure who blends into the background. But when he cleared his throat, the sound cut through the air sharper than a bell. The laughter died instantly, like someone had thrown a shroud over the room. He carried a folder in his hands, simple and unadorned, but the weight of it seemed heavier than stone. "This," he said, his voice steady, "is a letter. Margaret's last letter. She asked that it be read aloud today before anyone leaves." A ripple went through the room, whispers shifting in seats, the uneasy recognition that this wasn't part of the program. Ethan's face paled, his smirk faltering for the first time. I turned toward the lawyer, my breath caught in my throat. Margaret had left me no letter at home, no final words beyond the ones she'd whispered in her fading voice the night she passed. But here, in this moment, she had something left to say. The lawyer placed the folder gently on the lectern, opened it with deliberate care, and began to read. And in that instant, I knew. The humiliation Ethan had tried to brand into my skin was about to be burned away. Margaret had always been the one to see what others ignored, to plan for storms I never thought would come. And she had left behind not just words, but a reckoning. The air in the church grew heavy. Every ear strained for her voice, carried now through the lawyer's measured tone. Every eye turned toward me, toward Ethan, toward the family that was about to fracture under the weight of truths none of them expected. Margaret's letter would not just change the funeral, it would change everything. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat once more, and began to read aloud. His voice was calm, deliberate, yet every word carried the unmistakable rhythm of Margaret's presence. It was as if she were in the room again, weaving through the air, commanding attention, without needing to raise her tone. "My dearest Richard," it began, and my knees nearly buckled at the sound of her name for me. For decades she'd called me that when no one else did. Everyone else knew me as Rick. But to her, I was Richard, her husband, her partner, her equal. Hearing it spoken aloud in her voice, even through another man's lips, struck me deeper than anything Ethan had said. "You gave me a life of love and loyalty. You stood by me when sickness came, and you carried me through nights when even I thought I would not see morning. You are not useless, Richard. You never have been. You are the reason I endured." The church was silent now, every laugh smothered, every cough stilled. I could feel the weight of 100 stares shifting, first at the lawyer, then back at me, then at Ethan, who sat stiff as a board, his jaw set tight, his face flushed, but not from grief, from fear. Margaret's words continued, this time turning outward, addressing not just me, but the family she was leaving behind. "To my children, Ethan, Claire, and Daniel, know this. The strength of this family has always come from your father. You may not see it now, but you stand on the foundation of his sacrifices. He worked when his body ached. He endured when money was thin. He gave without demanding recognition. Without him, none of you would have had the lives you enjoy." I heard Claire sniffle from 2 pews back, her hand rising to her face. Daniel bowed his head, shoulders trembling. But Ethan, he stared forward, lips pressed thin, as though determined to outlast every syllable. The lawyer's voice grew firmer as he continued, "If I am remembered for anything, let it be that I loved Richard Hale with every fiber of my being. And if any of you should ever disrespect him or treat him as though he is less, remember this letter. Remember that my final words were not about wealth, not about accomplishments, but about the man who made all of it possible. Without him, I was nothing. Without him, you are nothing." Gasps rippled through the pews. Some looked at Ethan in open disbelief. Others turned their eyes away as if ashamed of what they had laughed at only minutes earlier. My heart pounded, torn between grief and vindication. Margaret was gone, Yet she had stood up for me in the only way left to her, by ensuring her voice would carry further than any insult. But the letter wasn't finished. The lawyer's eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan before continuing, his tone unwavering. "And to you, Ethan, my son, you have strength in you, but you also carry pride like a weapon. I know your tongue can be sharp, and I fear it will cut more than it will protect. You must learn that belittling your father is belittling yourself. For everything you are comes from him. If you dishonor him, you dishonor me." The air shifted again, like the church itself was holding its breath. Ethan's face twitched, his fingers digging into his knees as though ready to spring up and interrupt. But he didn't. He couldn't. Margaret's words chained him tighter than any hand ever could. The lawyer paused, turned a page, and lowered his voice slightly, almost reverently. "I leave behind no riches, no hidden fortune. What I leave is truth, and I charge you all to remember it. Richard was my anchor. Richard is your foundation. When the day comes that you forget, this letter will remind you." The lawyer closed the folder gently, almost like he was laying Margaret to rest a second time. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that doesn't invite words but demands reflection. I stood there frozen, hands trembling, tears running unchecked down my cheeks. For the first time since the day she passed, I didn't feel entirely alone. Her voice had cut through death, through humiliation, and planted itself firmly between me and my son's cruelty. Then slowly, heads began to turn. Not toward the casket, not toward the lawyer, but toward Ethan. Every eye in the room pinned him where he sat. His shoulders hunched slightly, his jaw twitching as he tried to hold his composure. But no one was laughing now. For a fleeting second, I thought he might stand and apologize. That grief had driven him to say something reckless, and now he would take it back. Instead, he smirked, bitter and defiant, though the mask was cracking. "She planned that," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Of course she'd defend him." His words didn't land the way he thought. They didn't spark agreement. They only deepened the glares aimed his way. Even his own siblings shifted uncomfortably, sliding further down the pew as if distancing themselves from his shadow. Margaret had spoken. She had left no room for doubt, and in doing so, she'd lit a fuse under everything Ethan thought he controlled. The funeral wasn't just about laying her to rest anymore. It had become a reckoning. And as I sat there, hands trembling in my lap, I realized something with startling clarity. This was only the beginning. The service ended in uneasy silence, broken only by the organ's low hum and the soft shuffle of feet against the church floor. People whispered as they passed me in the aisle, their hands reaching out to squeeze mine, their eyes full of sympathy. Not pity, sympathy. A shift had occurred, subtle but undeniable. Margaret's words had landed where mine could not. She had resurrected my dignity in front of everyone who had witnessed Ethan's cruelty. Oh, yet dignity didn't soothe grief. As the last hymn faded, I stood rooted beside her casket, my hand resting on the polished wood. I traced the grain of the oak, as though my fingers could somehow find her warmth there. All I wanted was one more moment, one more glance, one more laugh, one more whispered word in the stillness of night. Instead, all I had was silence, and the echo of Ethan's voice still clawing at the edges of my mind. Dad should have gone first. He's useless without her. When the pallbearers lifted the casket, my legs almost gave way. Claire appeared at my side, her hand sliding into mine like she used to as a little girl. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Daniel followed, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. But Ethan stayed at the front, his face set in a mask of stone as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just shattered the air with words meant to bury me alongside his mother. The burial was mercifully brief. The cold wind whipped against my coat, carrying with it the sharp scent of fresh earth. As Margaret was lowered into the ground, I felt as though half of myself was being lowered with her. The priest's words blurred, lost beneath the hollow pounding in my chest. I stood there long after the last spade of dirt had been thrown, watching the mound rise where she would rest. People drifted away one by one until I stood nearly alone. It was Claire who finally touched my arm. "Dad, come with us," she whispered. Her voice cracked, and I could see the pleading in her eyes. Daniel hovered nearby, his grief written across his face. But Ethan lit a cigarette at the edge of the cemetery, smoke curling around him like disdain. He didn't even glance my way. The anger I'd swallowed during the service began to stir again. Heavier now, mingling with sorrow until it became something sharper. We drove back to the church hall for the reception. Sandwiches, coffee, the faint clink of china. People murmured condolences, but their eyes kept flicking between me and Ethan. He avoided me, surrounding himself with a cluster of acquaintances who laughed too loudly as though nothing had happened. I caught snippets, business, politics, small talk. Not once did he mention his mother. When I sat down at one of the tables, Claire slid in beside me. Daniel soon followed. For a moment, it was just the three of us, as if we were children again, huddled around their mother's kitchen table. Claire leaned close and whispered, "Don't listen to him, Dad. You're not useless. You've never been." Daniel nodded, his voice low. Mom knew what she was doing. That letter wasn't for the church. It was for Ethan. She saw this coming. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. They were right. Margaret had always been a step ahead, always seeing storms on the horizon before I even noticed the clouds. That letter had been her final shield, not just for me, but for the whole family. Still, the wound remained. It wasn't the laughter of strangers that cut me deepest. It was that my own son had looked at me in my weakest moment and chosen mockery instead of mercy. As the reception thinned, Ethan finally approached. His walk was slow, deliberate, like a man preparing for a duel. The chatter in the room dimmed as eyes turned toward us. He sat across from me, a sneer tugging at his lips. "You think that letter changes anything?" he asked, voice just low enough that only I, Claire, and Daniel could hear. "She was blinded by you. She always was. That's why she wasted her last words on some pitiful defense." Claire gasped, and Daniel's fist clenched against the table. But I raised my hand to silence them. I looked into my son's eyes, the same eyes Margaret once called full of fire, now clouded with arrogance, and I realized something. Margaret hadn't written that letter to change Ethan. She had written it to reveal him, to show the world who he truly was when the mask slipped. I leaned forward, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "Your mother's words will outlast your cruelty, Ethan. Every person in that church heard her. They'll remember her strength long after they've forgotten your spite." For the first time, his composure faltered. Just a flicker, a twitch of uncertainty. But it was enough. He pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs scraping against the hall floor. "Believe what you want, old man," he spat. "But don't expect me to pretend you matter now. Without her, you're nothing." He stormed out, the door slamming behind him, leaving silence heavy in his wake. I sat there, staring at the space he'd left behind, my children on either side of me, the weight of Margaret's absence pressing down harder than ever. He thought I was broken. He thought I'd crumble. But as I drew in a shaky breath, I felt something different stirring. Not defeat, not despair, resolve. Margaret's letter hadn't just defended me. It had handed me a torch, and I intended to carry it. That night, when I returned home, the silence nearly suffocated me. For 45 years, Margaret's presence had filled every corner of that house. Her laughter still seemed to echo down the hallway. Her voice still lingered in the kitchen, where she'd call me for dinner. Her perfume still faintly clung to the pillows in our bedroom. But now it was only me, an old man moving through rooms too big for one soul. I hung my coat on the rack, the same one she had insisted we buy when the children were small. "It'll last a lifetime," she'd said, with that knowing smile. She was right. But what good was a lifetime without her? I poured myself a drink, my hands trembling as I set the glass on the table. I hadn't cried at the funeral. Not fully. Tears had come, yes, but rage had carried me through, kept me upright when Ethan tried to bury me in humiliation. Now, alone, the weight collapsed on me all at once. My chest heaved as I sank into my chair, my hand covering my face. For the first time, I let it all out. The sobs came violent, wrenching, the kind that left me gasping for air. I mourned Margaret. I mourned the years gone. And damn it, I mourned the son I thought I had. When the tears finally slowed, I reached for the folder the lawyer had given me after the service. "Keep it," he'd said. "It was meant for you, too." My fingers brushed the edges, rough from where he'd thumbed through it earlier. Inside was her letter, the original, written in her delicate looping script, pages upon pages of her final thoughts. The part read aloud was only a fraction. With shaking hands, I opened it. Her words spilled into me, warm and sharp all at once.
"Richard, I know how heavy grief can be, and I know Ethan's pride will wound you more deeply than any illness ever could. But remember this, you are not alone. Claire and Daniel see you, and one day, even Ethan will be forced to reckon with the man you truly are. I trust life to finish what I could not, but I want you to stand tall when it comes. Promise me that, Richard. Don't let their cruelty define you." I pressed the pages against my chest, my tears staining her handwriting. She had known, she had seen what I hadn't dared admit, that Ethan's resentment had been festering for years. He'd hidden it behind smiles, behind phone calls for money, behind hollow gestures of duty. Margaret had sensed it, and even as death approached, she'd prepared a defense I hadn't known I would need. The night stretched long. I sat by the window, whiskey untouched, watching the streetlights flicker across the quiet neighborhood. Every family on the block was settling in for the night, their homes glowing with warmth. My house, though, felt cold, hollow. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, and I dozed off in the chair. I woke with a start to the sound of the phone ringing, sharp and shrill in the silence. I fumbled for it, the clock on the wall reading past midnight. "Dad." It was Claire. Her voice was tight, trembling. "I just wanted to check on you. Daniel and I are worried." I swallowed, my throat raw. "I'm here. Don't worry about me." "We heard Ethan after the service," she whispered. "He was talking to some of Mom's cousins outside, making jokes about you, like he didn't care what people thought." The anger surged again, hot and bitter. "Of course he didn't," I said, my voice low. "Ethan hasn't cared for a long time." "Dad," she hesitated, "I think Mom wanted us to stay close." "The letter, it was more than just about you. It was about all of us, about what happens now." Her words sank deep. Margaret had always been the glue, the quiet force that kept us together. And now, without her, cracks were showing already. Ethan's cruelty was widening them, and if I wasn't careful, the whole family would splinter beyond repair. After we said goodnight, I sat in the stillness, clutching Margaret's letter once more. I thought of her faith in me, her plea that I not let their cruelty define me. She had left me more than memories. She had left me instructions.
I looked around the room, the framed photographs on the mantel, the couch where she'd fallen asleep reading countless nights, the quilt she had stitched by hand. For a moment, grief threatened to swallow me again, but beneath it, something else was beginning to grow. Resolve. Ethan thought I was useless without Margaret. He believed I would fade into nothing, a relic to be pitied or mocked. But Margaret's words burned like a brand at my chest. Stand tall when it comes. I rose from the chair, folded the letter carefully, and placed it on the mantel beside her picture. Her eyes, captured in that photograph, seemed to meet mine with quiet insistence. Don't worry, Margaret, I whispered into the empty room. I'll stand tall. For you, for me, and one day, for him too. The silence felt different then. Not hollow, not crushing, but heavy with promise. And though I didn't know it yet, that promise would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of condolences, casseroles, and unwanted visits. Neighbors stopped by with food I couldn't taste. Old friends called, their voices full of rehearsed sympathy. Even the pastor checked in, speaking of heaven and God's plan. None of it filled the void. None of it eased the sharp edges left by Margaret's absence. At night, the house grew colder. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me of footsteps that would never come again. Every shadow on the wall looked like her for a split second before dissolving into emptiness. I found myself reading her letter over and over, letting her voice guide me through the silence. But even her words couldn't stop the thoughts gnawing at me. Ethan, always Ethan. His words weren't fading, they were festering. One evening, about a week after the funeral, the doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer, but when I opened the door, there stood Claire and Daniel, bundled against the winter air. Claire's cheeks were red, her eyes still swollen from crying, while Daniel carried a grocery bag in one hand. "Dad," Claire said softly, "we didn't want you eating alone again." They came in without waiting for me to argue. Claire busied herself in the kitchen, heating up soup, while Daniel sat with me in the living room. He looked restless, his hands tapping against his knees. Finally, he spoke. "Ethan's been talking, Dad." His voice was low, cautious. "He's saying things about Mom's letter, about you." I felt my jaw tighten. "What things?" "That it was staged," Daniel said. "That the lawyer made it up, or that you had him read something you wrote yourself." I stared at him, disbelief mingling with fury. "He thinks I would forge your mother's last words?" Daniel shook his head quickly. "I don't believe it, Dad. Neither does Claire. But some people, they're listening to him. He's been calling family, telling them Mom was confused at the end, that she didn't know what she was saying." Claire entered with bowls of steaming soup, setting them gently on the table. She sat beside me, her hand slipping into mine. "He's poisoning them, Dad. He wants people to think Mom was wrong, that you don't deserve her words." The betrayal was sharp, but it wasn't surprising. Ethan had always carried pride like armor. But now, stripped bare by Margaret's letter, he was lashing out the only way he knew how, by twisting her memory. I sat in silence, staring into the soup I couldn't eat. For years I'd tried to excuse his arrogance. I told myself he was under pressure, that life had hardened him, that deep down he was still the boy I once carried on my shoulders. But this was different. This was war against the truth of the woman we all loved. Daniel leaned closer, his voice firm. "We won't let him get away with it. Mom's letter was clear. People heard it. But you need to be ready, Dad. Ethan's not going to stop." I nodded slowly, Margaret's words flashing in my mind. "Stand tall when it comes." Perhaps she had known Ethan would twist her final act into another weapon. Perhaps this was the storm she had prepared me for. That night, after Claire and Daniel left, I sat at my desk and pulled out an old box of files. Birth certificates, deeds, medical records, photographs, evidence of a life built with sacrifice and love. I spread them across the desk like pieces of a puzzle. For the first time in years, I wasn't just grieving, I was preparing, because Ethan had made one mistake at the funeral. He thought Margaret's letter had ended the story, but Margaret had only written the first chapter. The next one would be mine. 2 weeks after Margaret's funeral, I found myself invited, or rather summoned, to a family dinner at Ethan's house. Claire had called me the day before, her voice tight with nerves. "Dad, please come. He says he wants to clear the air." Clear the air. The phrase sat heavy on my chest. I knew Ethan. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit fault. If he was gathering us, it was because he had something to prove. Still, I agreed. Part of me wanted to see his face, to hear with my own ears what lies he'd wrapped around his mother's memory. When I pulled into his driveway, the house glared at me with this perfect symmetry and cold brick walls. Margaret and I had helped with the down payment years ago, back when Ethan promised he'd build a future worth admiring. Now, as I looked at it, all I saw was arrogance cemented into stone. Inside, the atmosphere was tense from the moment I stepped through the door. Isabella, his wife, greeted me with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. She led me into the dining room where Ethan sat at the head of the table, a glass of wine in hand, his expression already carrying the smugness of a man who thought he'd won before the fight began. Claire and Daniel were there too, sitting stiffly, their unease evident. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice dripping with false warmth, "I'm glad you came. We need to talk about Mom's letter." I sat, my back straight. "Go on." He swirled the wine in his glass before speaking, as though savoring his own performance. "Let's be honest. Mom wasn't herself those last months. Medication, pain, confusion. We all saw it. That letter, well, it doesn't sound like her. It sounds influenced." The room went cold. Claire's fork clattered against her plate. "Influenced," she said sharply. "By who?" Ethan's eyes slid to me. "By him." The accusation landed heavy, poisoning the air. Daniel leaned forward, fists tight. "That's disgusting, Ethan. You're saying Dad forged Mom's words? That he manipulated her?" Ethan raised his hands innocently, feigning calm. "I'm saying Mom was vulnerable. And Dad, well, maybe he wanted to protect himself from what we all know. That without her, he's nothing. Maybe he fed her those lines. Maybe he convinced her to write them." My hands trembled against the table, but I forced my voice steady. "Your mother was the strongest mind I ever knew. She didn't write what I told her. She wrote what she believed. Every word of that letter was hers." He smirked. "Convenient, isn't it? A letter that makes you look noble and me look cruel. Almost too perfect." Claire slammed her hand on the table. "She wrote it because she knew you'd do this, Ethan. She knew you'd try to tear Dad down. That letter was her shield against you." The mask cracked on Ethan's face just for a moment. His lips tightened, his nostrils flared. But then he leaned back, casual again. "People are starting to wonder, you know. Cousins, neighbors. They've called me. They're asking if Mom really wrote it. I tell them the truth, that she was confused, that Dad put ideas in her head." I felt the weight of Margaret's photo burning in my mind, her eyes urging me to stand tall. "Let them wonder," I said quietly. "The truth doesn't bend because of your pride. It stands." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, old man? That letter doesn't change what you are. Without her, you're weak, and sooner or later, everyone will see it." Silence spread around the table like a stain. Claire's eyes brimmed with tears. Daniel's fists trembled. Isabella sat smugly in her chair. But me? I met my son's gaze, unwavering. "You've mistaken my grief for weakness," I told him, "but grief passes. Truth does not. And one day, Ethan, you'll choke on the truth you're trying so hard to bury." He laughed, sharp and hollow, and raised his glass. "We'll see, Dad. We'll see." As I left that house, the winter air biting my skin, I realized something. Ethan wasn't just lost in pride. He was preparing for battle. And so was I. It didn't take long before Ethan's words began to spread. Small towns have a way of carrying gossip like wildfire. And though Spokane wasn't exactly small, its neighborhoods might as well have been villages. At the grocery store, I noticed it first. The sideways glances, the hushed voices when I walked past. A woman I'd known for years, who once sat beside Margaret at church, offered me a stiff smile instead of her usual hug. At the post office, a clerk I'd always greeted with friendly banter suddenly grew curt, sliding my package across the counter without meeting my eyes. And at Sunday service, the pew where Margaret and I had sat for decades seemed lonelier than ever. Not because she was gone, but because whispers filled the air behind me. "They say she wasn't in her right mind." Her son told me she was confused toward the end. Can you imagine? Forging a letter like that? The words stabbed deeper than I wanted to admit. I left early, my head bowed, the weight of judgment pressing down with every step. Margaret's defense, her last gift to me, was being twisted into a weapon against me. That evening, Claire came by with Daniel, both of them furious. "Dad, he's poisoning everyone," Claire said, pacing the living room. "He told Aunt May you pressured Mom to write that letter. He even said you rehearsed it with her." Daniel sat forward in his chair, his voice like steel. "I confronted him. He laughed in my face. Said you're too old to fight back. Said no one would believe you over him." I listened quietly, letting their words sink in. Ethan's arrogance was spilling into the open now, and people were buying it. I wasn't just mourning Margaret anymore. I was defending her honor, her words, and my own place in the family she and I had built. That night after they left, I sat at my desk again. The folder of documents lay open. Margaret's letter, the lawyer's notarized copies, even the funeral program. My hands lingered on the letter, tracing her handwriting. She had known Ethan would try to dismantle me. She had known he would choose pride over truth. And yet, part of me still hoped he would stop. That grief had made him cruel, and time would soften him. But as the days stretched on, his defiance only grew. Friends I had known for decades stopped calling. Neighbors waved half-heartedly from across the street, but didn't cross the fence anymore. The humiliation stung, but beneath it, something else began to take shape. Margaret's words echoed louder each day. "Stand tall when it comes." This wasn't just about surviving whispers. It was about exposing truth in a way that couldn't be silenced. The first step came unexpectedly. One evening, as I sat reading her letter again, the phone rang. It was the lawyer, the same one who had read Margaret's words aloud at the funeral. His voice was calm, but firm. "Richard," he said, "I thought you should know. Ethan's been contacting my office. He's demanding to see the original letter. He's claiming I fabricated it." My grip on the phone tightened. "And what did you tell him?" "That Margaret entrusted it to me months before she passed. That I have her signed instructions, witnessed by 2 others. Ethan didn't like that answer." I closed my eyes, relief and sorrow battling inside me. Margaret had been meticulous, even in death. She hadn't just written the letter, she had protected it. "Richard," the lawyer added, his tone gentler now, "I don't usually offer advice outside legal matters. But your wife, she planned for this. She knew your son's pride could become destructive. She wanted you to know she left more than just a letter. She left something else with me. Something I believe she wanted read at the right time. My heart stopped. Another letter? He hesitated. Not exactly, but I can't say more without her instructions. Just know this. You're not finished hearing from her. When I hung up the phone, my hands trembled. The room felt charged, as though Margaret herself were standing there, unseen but undeniable. She hadn't left me defenseless. She had left me armed. And though Ethan thought he had buried me beneath whispers and lies, he had no idea what was waiting for him. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering. The storm broke 3 weeks later. By then, the whispers had grown into something ugly. Open suspicion, thin the veil of disdain. I heard it in the pauses when old friends spoke to me, in the way neighbors avoided eye contact, in the invitations that stopped coming. Ethan's poison was working. He hadn't just attacked me. He had managed to tarnish Margaret's memory, turning her final act of love into something people questioned. One afternoon, I drove to the market. It used to be a simple errand, the kind of thing Margaret and I did together on Saturdays. But now, the aisles felt hostile. 2 women stood by the produce section, their voices low, but not low enough. They say he forged it. Imagine using your wife's funeral to make yourself look good. He's desperate, can't handle being alone. I stood there holding an apple, my chest burning. For a moment, I wanted to shout, to throw their gossip back in their faces. But I didn't. Instead, I left my cart where it stood and walked out, the cold air outside hitting me like a slap. That night, the phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice cracked the moment she spoke. Dad, Ethan's gone too far. He's spreading rumors about Mom's marriage. About you. My breath caught. What kind of rumors? That she stayed with you out of pity. That you held her back. He's saying Mom only wrote that letter because you manipulated her, because she felt guilty leaving you behind. Her voice broke into sobs. It's not true, Dad. Everyone who knew you both knows it's not true. But he's saying it to anyone who will listen. For the first time in my 72 years, I felt rage boil hot enough to scorch my bones. It wasn't enough that he humiliated me at the funeral. It wasn't enough that he twisted Margaret's last words. Now he was dragging her memory through the mud, staining the very love that defined both of our lives. Claire, I said, my voice low and steady, I want you and Daniel to stay out of this. Do you hear me? This is mine to handle now. She tried to protest, but I cut her off. Your mother left me the tools. She trusted me to carry this through. I won't let him destroy her. After I hung up, I went to the mantel. Margaret's photo stared back at me, her eyes kind, her smile calm. Beside it, the letter lay in its folder, but my mind kept returning to the lawyer's words. She left something else with me. You're not finished hearing from her. The next morning, I called his office. It's time, I told him. 2 days later, I was sitting in his downtown office, the smell of leather and paper heavy in the air. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk, Margaret's handwriting scrawled across the front. For Richard, to be opened if Ethan dishonors you. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside were several pages, written in the same looping script that had been hers since the day we met. I read silently at first, but soon the words demanded to be heard. Richard, if you are reading this, then Ethan has let pride guide him into cruelty. I prayed it wouldn't come to this, but I know my son. He is restless, ambitious, and sometimes blind to love when his pride is wounded. This letter is not for comfort, it is for clarity. Enclosed, you will find the truth, the full account of what you gave for this family, the money, the sacrifices, the years you surrendered without complaint. I documented it because I knew one day he would try to erase it. I looked up sharply. The lawyer nodded toward a second envelope. Inside were receipts, bank statements, copies of checks, every sacrifice I had made cataloged and preserved by Margaret herself. The down payment on Ethan's first house, the loans I had co-signed, the debts I had quietly covered, even the money I had poured into Claire's and Daniel's education, never expecting a thank you. Margaret had kept it all. She had built a record, a weapon wrapped in truth. My throat tightened as I read her closing words. If Ethan tries to shame you, let him choke on the truth. I could not stop him in life, but I will not let him dishonor you in death. Use this when the moment comes, Richard, and it will come. I left the lawyer's office with the folder clutched in my hands, heavier than steel. For the first time since Margaret's passing, I didn't just feel grief. I felt direction. 2 days later, the moment came. It was a family gathering at Claire's house, meant to honor Margaret quietly, with just the children and a few close relatives. I knew the second I walked in that Ethan was going to turn it into another stage. He was already there, wine in hand, his voice carrying above the murmur of conversation. Mom loved us, of course, he was saying to a cluster of cousins. But let's be real. She pitied Dad. She made him look good in that letter because she knew he couldn't survive without her. He's been living in her shadow for decades. The laughter, small, nervous, uncertain, rippled through the group. But this time, I didn't shrink. I didn't bow my head. I walked straight into the circle, the folder tucked beneath my arm. Enough, I said, my voice steady but sharp. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to me. Ethan smirked, but I saw the flicker of unease behind it. Dad, he said mockingly, you really want to do this here? Yes, I replied. Because Margaret left me the truth, and it's time you and everyone else heard it. I laid the folder on the table and began to open it. The air thickened. The family leaned closer. Ethan's smirk faltered. And for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I wasn't just defending myself. I was about to expose him. I opened the folder with deliberate care, the way Margaret would open her recipe book, as though what was inside carried the weight of an entire legacy. The family leaned in, the air tense enough to snap. Ethan shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering, though he quickly forced it back onto his face like a mask. This, I said, my voice steady, is Margaret's handwriting. Her files, her preparation. She left me more than just a letter. I pulled out the first stack of papers, copies of checks, receipts, bank statements, and spread them across the table like cards in a game he didn't even know we were playing. Here's the down payment on your first house, Ethan. $45,000. Margaret and I drained our savings to make it happen. Here are the loans I co-signed when your ventures failed. Here's the money I poured into bailing you out when you couldn't cover your own debts. And here, I slid another paper forward, are the transfers I made every month to keep you afloat when you were too proud to admit you were drowning. Gas rippled around the room. Cousins leaned closer. Claire and Daniel nodded grimly, already familiar with the sacrifices, but never having seen them laid out like this. Ethan's face darkened, his hands clenching at the arms of his chair. You kept track of all that? One aunt asked, her voice hushed. I didn't, I said, tapping the folder. Margaret did. She knew this day would come. She knew her son's pride could twist even her last words into lies. So she left me this, not just to defend me, but to remind all of you who I was, what I did for this family. Ethan barked out a laugh, sharp and hollow. So what? You gave money. You helped us when we needed it. That doesn't make you some kind of saint. That doesn't mean Mom wasn't confused when she wrote that letter. But his voice lacked its usual conviction. He could feel the tide turning. I pulled out the final page, Margaret's looping script clear for all to see. She wasn't confused. She was precise. She wrote, "If Ethan dishonors you, show them this. Let him choke on the truth he tries to bury." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every pair of eyes fixed on Ethan. His smirk was gone now, replaced with something tighter, uglier, panic clawing at the edges of his composure. Claire stood abruptly, her voice trembling with fury. "How dare you?" Mom knew exactly what she was saying. "And she was right about you. You've done nothing but take, and then spit on the hands that carried you." Daniel's fist slammed against the table. "You humiliated Dad at Mom's funeral, Ethan. You laughed while people mocked him. And now you've been spreading lies about her, about them both. Enough." Ethan rose from his chair, his voice rising to match. "Don't lecture me. You two don't understand what it's like to carry responsibility. Dad was weak. Mom carried him her whole life, and you know it." But the room no longer supported him. The cousins who had laughed at his jokes earlier now stared with open disgust. One of the uncles shook his head, muttering, "Shameful." An elderly family friend whispered, "Your mother would be heartbroken." Ethan's face flushed deep red. He looked around the room, searching for allies and finding none. Even Isabella, usually smug at his side, looked away, her cheeks pale. I stood slowly, the folder still in my hand. My voice cut through the chaos with calm finality. Margaret carried this family, yes. She carried it with me. And together, we gave all of you more than you deserved. You can try to bury me under lies, Ethan, but truth doesn't rot. It stands. I turned to the rest of the room, holding Margaret's letter aloft. She chose her words carefully. She wanted you all to remember, I am not useless. I am not a shadow. I am the man she loved, the man who built this family. And if you forget that, you dishonor her as much as you dishonor me. The silence broke not with laughter, but with murmurs of agreement. Heads nodded, eyes softened. The tide had shifted entirely. Ethan's arrogance, his campaign of whispers, had been ripped apart in one evening. Ethan glared at me, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, old man? This isn't over." But his words rang hollow now. He stormed out, the door slamming behind him, leaving the rest of us in stunned quiet. I sat back down, my heart pounding, but my hands steady. Margaret had prepared me for this moment, and together, even in death, we had silenced him. Yet as the room slowly returned to murmurs and uneasy conversation, I knew Ethan wasn't finished. Pride doesn't die in a single night. It festers. It plots. And the next storm was already building. The days after that confrontation felt like walking through the eye of a storm. The house was quiet, but not with the hollow grief of the first weeks. It was quiet with the weight of something unresolved. Margaret's folder sat on my desk like a sentinel, the documents inside a reminder that truth had teeth. I should have felt relief. I should have felt vindicated. But instead, I felt something darker, a gnawing awareness that Ethan would not accept defeat so easily. At the family gathering, he had lost the room. I saw it in the way people avoided his gaze, the way they whispered in corners afterward, the way his own siblings had turned against him. But humiliation doesn't humble a man like Ethan. It enrages him. And sure enough, the first blowback came 3 days later. I was sitting in the living room, a cup of black coffee in hand, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to an old colleague of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Rick," he said, his voice cautious, "I hate to even bring this up, but your son's been talking. He's telling people you're unstable, that Margaret left that letter because she was afraid of you. I closed my eyes, the coffee turning to ash in my mouth. Afraid of me? That's what he's saying, my colleague continued. Look, I know it's nonsense. We all saw how you treated her. But gossip spreads fast, and he's convincing people. Be careful. Protect yourself. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and sat in silence, my knuckles white around the mug. Afraid of me? The words slithered like snakes through the walls of the house, coiling around everything Margaret and I had built. It wasn't enough for Ethan to discredit me. Now he was trying to turn me into a monster in my wife's memory. That evening, Claire came by. She found me sitting by the fire, the folder open on my lap. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. She just sat beside me, her hand on mine. He's unraveling, she said quietly. Daniel heard from a cousin. Ethan's furious that people turned on him the other night. He's doubling down, Dad. But people aren't buying it the way they used to. They saw the proof. They heard Mom's words. He can scream all he wants, but the truth is louder now. I nodded, but my chest was still tight. Lies are louder at first. They spread faster than truth. Margaret knew that. That's why she left this. I tapped the folder. Claire's eyes glistened. Mom always believed in you. She knew you'd stand tall. And you did. But did I? The truth had silenced Ethan in that room, yes. But he wasn't finished. And I knew, deep in my bones, that he would rather burn everything down than admit defeat. The next Sunday, I returned to church. I hadn't been since the funeral. I expected the whispers, the sideways glances, the doubts. Instead, something unexpected happened. People greeted me warmly. Old friends hugged me. A woman I hadn't spoken to in years squeezed my hand and said, "Margaret was right about you." It was as though the tide had turned. The truth Margaret had left behind was beginning to drown out Ethan's poison. But victories in my life had never come without a price. The following week, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single page, typed, unsigned. The words were venom. "You're pathetic. Without her, you are nothing. Everyone knows it. Why don't you do the world a favor and fade away?" I read it once, twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the folder with Margaret's documents. Not out of fear, not even out of anger, but as part of the record. Because that's what Margaret had done. Kept records, prepared for storms. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet, I realized something. Ethan wasn't just lashing out in anger. He was desperate. He could feel control slipping, his narrative collapsing, and he was scrambling to claw it back. And desperate men make mistakes. I looked at Margaret's photograph on the mantel, her smile steady, her eyes full of quiet certainty. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew he'd come undone." The fire popped in the hearth, the embers glowing like the promise she'd left me. I didn't know how or when, but I knew the breaking point was coming. Ethan thought he was waging war on me, but in truth, he was waging war on his mother's memory, and no one wins that war. It was late February when the cracks in Ethan's carefully polished mask finally widened into full fractures. By then, weeks of his venom had left their mark, rumors swirling, lies dripping like poison into conversations at grocery stores, barbershops, and even after Sunday service. He still had a few who entertained his story, but the majority had grown weary of his bitterness. Pride has a way of souring in the open air. One evening, I received a call from Daniel. His voice was clipped, urgent. "Dad, you should come. Ethan's at it again. He's at Uncle Ray's house, ranting in front of half the family. It's getting ugly." I didn't want to go. Every fiber of me wanted to stay in my chair, clutching Margaret's letter, and let him drown in his own pride. But then I heard her words in my mind. "Stand tall when it comes." This was the moment she'd prepared me for. When I arrived, the house was thick with tension. Family gathered in the living room, clustered on couches and chairs. Ethan stood in the center, pacing like a man cornered by shadows. His face was flushed, his gestures sharp, wineglass in hand. "She wasn't in her right mind," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You all know it. She was sick, medicated. That letter, Dad fed it to her. He made her write it to save face because he couldn't stand the truth, that he's weak." Murmurs ran through the room. Some averted their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably. And then Ethan saw me. His expression twisted, equal parts fury and fear. "Well, look who finally showed up," he sneered. "The grand victim. Here to milk Mom's death a little more?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I came because Margaret deserves better than this circus. He laughed, but it was a hollow, jagged sound. "You think anyone believes you? You're pathetic, Dad. You're clinging to her words like they're scripture, when everyone knows she pitied you. You were nothing without her, and you'll die nothing." I stepped closer, the folder in my hand, the same folder Margaret had prepared with care. I laid it on the coffee table and opened it for everyone to see. Receipts, bank statements, checks, all the proof of years I had sacrificed for him and his siblings. "You want to talk about truth?" I said. "Here it is. Every dollar your mother and I poured into your life, every sacrifice she kept record of, because she knew your pride would one day make you forget. She wasn't confused, Ethan. She was prepared." The room was silent. Eyes darted between the papers, between me and Ethan. His jaw worked furiously, but words failed him. "Your mother left this because she loved you," I continued, my voice trembling. Not from fear, but from the weight of it all. "Even knowing how cruel you could be, she still believed one day you'd see the truth. But instead, you've chosen to spit on her memory." For the first time, his composure cracked wide open. His face twisted, tears brimming in his eyes, but his voice broke into a shout. "She loved me more than you. She told me once. She said I was her favorite." Gas rippled. Claire stood, her voice firm. "No, Ethan. She never said that. She loved us all. But you've twisted even her love into a weapon." Daniel stepped forward, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. "You've humiliated Dad. You've mocked Mom's memory. You've poisoned this family for weeks. Enough." Ethan's chest heaved as he looked around the room. No one nodded. No one spoke in his defense. His allies were gone. All that remained was the bitter echo of his own voice. He slammed the wineglass onto the table, shattering it, red spilling across the documents like blood. "You'll regret this," he hissed, but even he didn't sound convinced. He stormed out, the door rattling behind him, leaving silence heavy in his wake. I looked down at the folder, the papers stained but still legible, proof enduring even under his rage. I gathered them slowly, carefully, as if honoring Margaret herself. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to peace. Not because the war was over, no, I knew Ethan's pride would find new ways to lash out. But because Margaret had been right. Standing tall didn't mean shouting louder. It meant outlasting the storm. And tonight, I had. Would you like me to carry Section 12 into the legal and social consequences Ethan faces after this collapse, where the family and even the wider community begin to turn their backs on him completely? The days after Ethan's outburst at Uncle Ray's house were different. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I could walk into the grocery store without whispers crawling at my back. Neighbors waved again. At church, old friends pressed my hand and said, "We heard what happened." Their eyes no longer carried suspicion. They carried pity, but not for me. For him. Word had spread faster than Ethan's lies ever could. His drunken rage, his shattered wine glass, his wild claim that Margaret had called him her favorite. It had unraveled whatever credibility he had left. Pride had driven him to the edge, and in the end, he'd pushed himself over. Claire and Daniel came by one evening, their faces weary but relieved. Claire set down a casserole on the table, just like her mother used to, and said softly, "Dad, people see the truth now. They know who you are, and they know who he's become." Daniel nodded. "It's over for Ethan, at least with the family. No one trusts him. Aunt May told me she doesn't want him at her house anymore. Even Uncle Ray said he's not welcome back until he apologizes. And you know Ray. He forgave everyone, even the cousin who stole his car." I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe the storm had passed. But storms don't end with one clap of thunder. They linger, they drip, they test the ground they've soaked. Sure enough, the next week brought another letter, this one official, delivered by certified mail. I signed for it with steady hands, though my heart quickened as I slid it open. Inside was a notice of legal proceedings. Ethan was contesting Margaret's letter, claiming it was fraudulent, that she had not been of sound mind when she wrote it. Claire was furious when she saw it. How dare he drag Mom's memory into court? How dare he? Daniel's fists clenched. He's going to humiliate himself. Everyone heard the lawyer. Everyone saw the documents. He doesn't have a leg to stand on. But I only felt tired. Tired, but resolute. Margaret had prepared me for this too. The lawyer had already confirmed the letter's validity, the witnesses, the notarized instructions. Ethan wasn't building a case. He was digging his own grave. When I met with the lawyer again, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Mr. Hale, I've seen this before. Children who can't accept their parents' choices, who rewrite history to soothe their pride. But your wife, she was meticulous. The letter, the documentation, the witnesses. She left no cracks for him to slip through. Legally, he doesn't stand a chance. But emotionally," he paused, "he may burn every bridge left trying." The hearing was set for early spring. In the meantime, the family split further. Cousins who once chuckled at Ethan's jokes now avoided him. Old friends whispered about his downfall. Even Isabella, once smug at his side, stopped attending gatherings, embarrassed by his spiraling behavior. And Ethan, he called once, just once. His voice was slurred, bitter, thick with drink. "You think you've won, old man," he spat. "But you'll see. Without Mom, you're nothing. You'll die alone, and no one will remember you." I listened silent until he ran out of breath. Then I said only one thing before hanging up. "Your mother remembers me, and that's enough." The line went dead. That night, as I sat by the fire, Margaret's photo glowing in the lamplight, I felt a shift inside me. The grief was still there, sharp and heavy. But alongside it, something else had taken root. Strength. Ethan's collapse was no longer my burden to carry. It was his. Margaret's letter had not only defended me, it had exposed him. The world now saw what she had always known, that pride, unchecked, destroys from within. And though the battle wasn't over, I understood now what standing tall meant. It wasn't about shouting the loudest. It was about enduring, outlasting, waiting for truth to do what lies never could. Spring was coming, and with it the reckoning Ethan had brought upon himself. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper, the kind of smell that clings to places where truth and lies wrestle daily. I walked in wearing my best suit, the one Margaret had chosen for me years ago. My steps were slow but steady, each one echoing louder than Ethan's venom ever had. Claire and Daniel flanked me, their faces grim but determined. They weren't just my children that morning. They were Margaret's shield, still standing with me. Ethan arrived late, as if drama could rewrite reality. He strutted into the courtroom with Isabella at his side, his tie crooked, his eyes red-rimmed from drink or sleepless nights, or both. For all his bravado, I saw it. The cracks. Pride had gnawed at him so long that what remained was a hollow man wearing arrogance like a paper mask. The judge called the case. Ethan's lawyer spoke first, a slick man with a thin voice. He argued Margaret had been confused in her final months, her mind clouded by medication and illness. He claimed the letter was coerced, that I had manipulated her into signing words she didn't mean. The more he spoke, the more absurd it sounded. But he pressed on, fueled by Ethan's desperation. Then our lawyer stood, calm, deliberate, precise. He produced the original letter, Margaret's signature clear, witnessed and notarized months before her decline. He presented the receipts, the bank statements, the meticulous records Margaret had preserved, her handwriting on each folder, each note, each page. He called the witnesses who had been with her when she gave him the sealed envelope, their testimonies unwavering. Every piece fit perfectly, a puzzle Margaret herself had arranged before death claimed her. She hadn't left room for doubt. She had built a fortress of truth. Ethan's lawyer faltered, his voice growing thinner with each objection overruled, each fact presented. By the time our lawyer finished, the courtroom was heavy with silence. Truth sat in the air like iron, undeniable and unshakable. The judge's words were clear, final. The letter stands. It is authentic, binding, and indisputable. Mrs. Hale's final words reflect her full capacity and intent. This case is dismissed. Ethan's face collapsed. The mask shattered, pride spilling into raw fury. He rose from his seat, his voice breaking into a shout. "This is a lie. He made her write it. You're all blind. He's nothing without her." But no one listened. The bailiff ushered him back down, his shouts echoing like the death rattle of a pride that had finally eaten itself whole. Isabella stood off to the side, her eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, Margaret's letter safe in the folder beside me. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply breathed. For the first time in months, I breathed freely. When it was over, we stepped outside. The spring air was cool, the sky wide and bright, the kind of day Margaret loved. Claire squeezed my hand, her eyes shining. "She won, Dad. Mom won." Daniel's voice was firm, certain. "Number you won, because you never bent. You never let him bury you." I looked up at the sky, imagining Margaret's face among the clouds, her smile carrying me the way it always had. "No," I said softly, "we all won. Because truth outlasts lies. Always." Ethan didn't speak to me again after that. He drifted further, his pride leaving him isolated. His name little more than a cautionary tale, whispered in corners of family gatherings he no longer attended. And though it hurt to lose a son, it would have hurt more to lose myself. That night, I placed Margaret's letter back on the mantel. I lit a candle beside her photograph, the flame flickering softly against her smile. I sat in my chair, the house still quiet, but not empty. Not anymore, because Margaret was right. Standing tall wasn't about winning arguments. It wasn't about silencing laughter or drowning lies. It was about outlasting, about carrying love and truth beyond the reach of cruelty. And as I sat there, the candlelight warming the room, I whispered into the silence, "I stood tall, Margaret, just like you asked." For the first time since she left, I felt her presence, not in grief, but in peace. And I knew then that the world would forget many things, it would never forget the real Margaret.